So I'll start by locating us within Scotland. You probably all know where it is. It's near Moth. It's a wonderful valley. Let's have a look at it. Ice scoured, and at this bottom end, it has a terminal moraine so that it's slightly hidden from the road. And that's been a huge advantage to us because it sort of adds an element of surprise, because you can see what's in the foreground and then don't know that you've got this huge valley behind. But look, it's not just ice scoured, it's completely bitten to the quick by sheep. Sheep, goats, lots of feral goats around when we saw it first, and deer. Probably few deer then, but plenty who like to get in there now. And this is the first tree planting, which was on Millennium Day, because it just so happened that we managed to raise all the funds in the December before, and the completion was arranged for the Millennium Day. And then we had a dilemma as who was going to plant the first tree. So we lined up 100 trees and 100 people, lots of families, including small children. And we decided we'd better be egalitarian about it. And my son blew a bugle and we all planted our trees at the same time. So nobody planted the first tree. It was a communal enterprise. And that's been very much the spirit of the thing thereafter. We've always had the philosophy of whatever you can do with volunteers, do it. Not to say that we've done all the planting that way, because there's just been too much. But lots of things like the management plan, which was drawn up before we actually had possession of the site, which was done by Philip Ashmole and a man called Adrian Newton, who worked it out. And then the Wildwood group went through it paragraph by paragraph, discussing it and changing it a little. And when we finally submitted it to the Forestry Commission, because we were at that stage after planting grants, they said it was one of the best management plans they've ever seen. So here's some comparative views, looking down the valley 20 years ago, and then a bit of what it looks like in autumn these days. And of course it changes year on year, and you're getting more tree establishment up here, which was the last bit to be planted, which is also a bit higher, a bit more challenging in aspect. So it's never going to be quite as lush as the foot of the valley. Oh, why can't I move? Oh, there we are. This is a map to show you that we've got our valley here at the bottom of that yellow. The black line is SNH, as was a designated wild land area in the southern uplands. And the yellow bits are the other bits of land owned by Borders Forest Trust. We have Core Head to the west and Taller and Gameshope, which actually marches with Carrifran, which is a very large area, very high plateau, rocky, but it makes up the three of these places, and of course the National Trust holding to the east, a very considerable bit of land already in environmental management. And of course the aspiration is ultimately to expand that outwards if we can. It certainly would be very nice to link up Core Head with the other two sites. I've put in a map of our valley, which we've had for a long time now, but it does show the planting year on year. So we move from the bottom here, sort of round the valley, excluding grazing animals bit by bit, so that the sward didn't get too long before we did our tree planting. And that strategy worked very well. And it worked for us and it worked for the farmer, who was able to go on claiming various subsidies for a few more years. And that tided him over.
Saddle yoke.
Yes, saddle yoke up one side. And here's our mission statement, which we like to keep in mind because it is a bit different from other people's. A lot of projects are set up very much with people and recreation in mind. And ours has always been set up with wildlife in mind. So we're wanting this mainly forested wilderness with lots of native species. We chose the time before human activities became dominant because we know that it was wooded beforehand. And that was what we sought to make it like again. And we've decided we never wanted to exploit this woodland commercially, so we won't cut timber, we won't coppice it. And we try to manage people very, very carefully. Of course, they're welcome, but we don't like to be on tourist maps. We keep our car park door shut, so it's not locked, but we don't really want very casual visitors. We want people to come who are interested in it. Unfortunately, like a lot of sites, we got some fly campers, dirty campers last year, who put up their tents on our track, lit a fire, and then went away and left a horrible mess, including all their equipment. Extraordinary, but that's something that happens these days. Hang on. Sorry, I'm finding it very difficult to get it on the right one. The reason we were able to know what vegetation was like before man made an impact is because of the rotten bottom bow find, which was a wandering psychiatrist from Dingleton actually picked up a stick from a peat bog and took it home. An archaeologist declared it was probably the oldest bow found in Britain, 6,000 years old, and therefore dating to the cusp of the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, so just before man made a serious impact with herds and farming of one sort and another. And on the back of that bow find, a lot of core sampling was done under the auspices of the museum. And this is some of the stuff that was found. I mean, it shows you about grasses and heather and some very important species like elm and oak and pine and alder and birch. There is more. Oh yes, and yeah, there are other trees as well. But this is just indicative of the sort of stuff that we know about. That's line down the middle is the rotten bottom bow, but they say that this is one of the best core samples for upland Britain, and an amazing record. Now, going on to what I said about volunteers, they have been a tremendous workforce. There is John Savory, who I was referring to before the talk started, in the foreground, and some other people, several of whom are still working for us, you know, even though 16 years on, they're all a lot older. Alas, we've lost John. But some of the jobs are wonderful, like this was in Glen Truel, I think, collecting acorns, because all the seed has to be very carefully chosen for its provenance. But there aren't many suitable sessile oak trees near to us, so we go quite far afield to get oak. And this is collecting in Glen Truel in the autumn, but not all volunteering is quite so idyllic. There is a band of people who patrol the boundary fence once a month, so there's a rota, but they do it in all weathers. And as you can see, I think that probably is up on Saddle Yoke. It's quite challenging to be up there in the winter, and we make people go in twos. That chapter, notice, is holding a hammer, and the boundary wardens do all the instant fence repair that they can and note where they need professionals in. And for that reason, we've managed to keep this high stock fence up for 20 years, whereas the average life of a stock fence is only about 15 before it becomes really permeable. We couldn't put a deer fence in because it's too high, and sheep netting fills with snow and then the whole thing just blows over. But this fence has worked extremely well for us. Just some pictures of vegetation, one of the valley filling up with trees, and then a sense of what it's like being under the woods. I mean, that's a bit pixelated on the left, I'm sorry, but it's a bit think of it as an impressionist painting. And then this one, which shows you how high some of the trees are getting. There will be more pictures later on. We were worried, our botanist, Stuart Adair in particular, was worried that as we took the grazing away, the rough grasses, nardus and things like that, would begin to dominate. But this chart of Stuart's shows you that the heathers and also things like blaeberry are actually expanding down the hill where we thought it would become much more grassy. And those are much more healthy because they allow germination of other things like trees into them, whereas a thick grass sward doesn't. So we're seeing really good vegetational change and much more potential in this landscape than we could have dreamt of. And it was extremely exciting as this story slowly unfolds. Well, it's still unfolding. It's changing all the time. It's one of the most interesting things about it. It's such a dynamic thing. This is what happens when you take away grazing. That was just removing grazing. So only less than a decade later, this ivy, which had been stunted because things got at it, you can see how bedraggled it is where goats could get at it. And without the goats and sheep, look at it, absolutely flourishing. It's one of only 3 or 4 plants that were in the valley. But ivy is one of the things that we're putting back, ivy and honeysuckle, because they make such amazing habitat for birds. They make really secure shelter for birds. And they're absent from so many woodlands. Oh, back one, please. No. Sorry. It's very sensitive, this. That was a nice one, I thought, to show you a bridge built by Jeremy Cunningham, which used to be part of a circular trail, but we lost the stepping stones to get back over the berm. But this just shows you how well the heather has grown. This is at a low level. How lush the trees are. Every one of those trees you're looking at is planted, but they don't look it. We managed to instruct our tree planters, who are mostly a group of people called Tree Serve. Very early on, we taught them that we didn't want anything in straight lines. We wanted a sort of random arrangement of trees with grouping and with open spaces. And they've done it for us, and it is people walk through and they can't really believe that it's not natural because it looks it. And quite big areas of land are actually open, but that's all by design because we want woodland edge is one of the best habitats that you can create. It supports the greatest variety of species. Right, the next one's slightly self-indulgent because it's my grandchildren, but they're enjoying themselves. But look at that tall herb community where there was just that bare grassland. Do you remember that Millennium Day picture? Well, it's in the same sort of area of the valley, and now we've got these amazing flowers. This is late summer, so you've got devil's bit scabious, knapweed, angelica, and I'm sure there's luzula, the wood rush in there. There'll be lots of meadowsweet still out. Lots of people come and they just can't believe the flowers. They're really worth seeing. And there's quite an interesting story in the next few slides of flowers. I just can't do it. Yes, there we are. This was an example. This sea campion was growing right up at the top on the cliffs and only on the cliffs. But now we're finding it all along the burn and flourishing. And the truth must be that its seeds will have been coming down the waterway forever. But in the past, anything that germinated would have just been nibbled away. But now there it is on the sides, and also very much beside the berm. No, gone too far. Oh, that's the one. Within the burn, at the confluence of where one comes down off the hill, there is a sort of island of flood debris, I suppose. It's quite big stones. And we've watched this be colonized by plants over the last 20 years. And some quite rare species, like this mountain sorrel on the left-hand side of this picture, have appeared. And there you see the sea campion again, really flourishing. And I think above the sorrel, there's also a saxifrage growing in there. There's a great diversity in this island. We know, in fact, the diversity was almost better about 4 years ago. And now some species are beginning to dominate and push the others out. But the beauty of this is, again, it's a dynamic situation. This isn't stable land. And another big flood some year coming will wash it all away again. And the whole process will start again. We'll see another succession. But up in the top there, a bluebell. There were always a few on site, but really grazed back. But very fascinatingly, they are popping up all over the place. And we don't know whether its seed is spreading or whether they were just so bitten back that you couldn't see they were there in the past. But there they are. The place is designated as a SSSI for its mires and flushes. And it's the flora that goes with it. And there was some anxiety that without grazing, these things might change and lose some of their special species. But this has not been the case at all. It's rather the reverse, that they're doing very well, thank you. And so these are some pretty flowers. Ragged robin, which is a marsh plant you're probably all familiar with. This is cloudberry that grows up high and does sometimes set berries in this country, more often in Norway. On the right, grass of Parnassus with its pretty penciled petals. And then there's a round-leaved sundew there and an early purple orchid. And both things are familiar enough in other settings, but you don't see very often in the borders. So it feels wonderful. We've got these growing in abundance now. And on the valley slopes, a lovely range. There's saxifrages, harebells, orchids, different sorts of saxifrage, and this pretty mountain pansy, which is a lovely plant that comes in very many colorways. And we are also undertaking a bit of translocation of plants. We wanted to get bearberry established, which is a plant related to cranberry and blaeberry, and grows in 1 or 2 sites in the borders. And we got permission from Nature Scotland to do it. Unfortunately, they want quite elaborate management plans for all these things. But this one we're doing, and there's volunteers facing quite a torrent to cross over to do the planting. But they're establishing, and the one down on the left you can see is doing very nicely. The other plant that's been brought in, or was from the beginning, was a fern called woodseer that was brought by the botanics, because we know it used to be here, and now it is flourishing again. It was exterminated by Victorian fern collectors. It was a great craze in the Victorian era. Right. Now, with changing vegetation, of course, we get changing insects. So we've been monitoring these, and quite often surveys are done during the summer. Tiger moth used to be common when I was a child, but it's a long time since I've seen one. So this is wonderful. They're so glorious. Their colours are great. This thing, which is a high flyer moth caterpillar, was found up on a woolly willow, Salix leponum, right up in some of our montane planting. And it was a species that really hadn't been seen in the area at all. It's miraculous how these things get here. It's quite magical. And then, oh, you have to see that little beast. That one. No, that one. A new insect for southern Scotland that some entomologists spotted. I've never met it before, but it's a hairy beast. And sorry, that was a Scotch Argus. I can't try and go back, it's too difficult. And the small pearl bordered fritillary, all these things flourishing. So because we have new habitat and new things to eat, lots more seeds from plants and lots more seeds from trees, we've got very much changing bird life. Got it. This is John Savory's chart, and I'll take you through it. The black line at the top shows the decline of the meadow pipit. Meadow pipit are species of open grassland, and we knew they would diminish. It doesn't really matter because they're a common bird and they're throughout the whole of the surrounding area. So if we have a few less in our valley, it doesn't matter too much. They were ubiquitous. Now, down at the bottom here, numbers 1 and 2, we've got a chaffinch and the willow warbler, which were the only two so-called woodland birds that were hanging on in the few bits of shrub and the very few trees that we had at the beginning. And you can see that for the first few years, nothing much changes. And it's not for about 8 years that you suddenly have got a couple of other species coming in. The black cap and the lesser redpoll appear. And after that, the grass just goes up and up, so that year on year, you're seeing more woodland birds colonizing. We're getting owls and robins and blackbirds and song thrush and jays. We always knew that jays were important for spreading acorns, but the full story of that I heard quite recently. It is absolutely amazing that jays collect acorns and bury them, and they remember the sites where they've buried them. They go to the sites, and when the planters come up, they see the emerging seedling. They tweak it out of the ground, eat the acorn, and then unbelievably they plant the sapling again, a bit haphazardly, but they pop it back in the ground so that you tend to still get an oak tree. I just find that an extraordinary symbiosis between bird and plant. It's a very nice picture of a blackcap singing last year by Richard Clarkson, who was the warden at Greymare's Tail, and a hobby, I think that was. I put this one this is ash dieback, which, like everywhere else, we're suffering. We don't mind too much about individuals dying because we need dead wood on site. It's again wonderful for insects and very useful, but it is very sad to think about how different the landscape is going to look without ash trees, which are a very, very important species. But the hope is that some are going to be resistant to the fungus, and the progeny of those ash trees will be wonderful because they do propagate very easily, and of course we know they come up like weeds, which they do in our gardens. So we don't think the ash tree story is over yet, but we are going to see a sad stage of it in the next few years. Right, that is actually the end of my my slides. Right, so I've talked for over half an hour, and masses more of this story to tell me. So I'm very, very happy to answer questions. Which are you going to field them to me, Janet?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best.
I do too.
There's quite a lot of people here, so if you have a question, and you probably best if you could type it into the chat. So at the bottom of the screen, I think it's on the bottom of the screen if you're on a phone or an iPad, but there's a little speaker bubble that says chat. If you click on that, it will give you a space to question on the right hand side of your screen, and you can type your question in there. And just while maybe people are thinking about questions for Fee, I'd got one. You said that you were not going to do any cutting of trees, and there's no grazing animals in the wood, and obviously you've got succession happening at the moment, and it's moving towards the sort of climax vegetation of trees, and you've got some woodland flowers coming in, but how are you going to prevent it becoming overgrown at some point in the future, where you've got the canopy closing more, and then you're going to have less sunlight coming into your understory plants.
Right, well,
To have limited grazing at some point, or?
yes, there is limited grading. Try as we will, we'll never control all the deer. We're taking perhaps 24 off a year, but there's still enough deer to make a little impact, but not too much on growing trees. So they're there. But we are at a stage where we're quite keen to open up a bit more ground to allow for germination of natural regeneration of trees in some of the areas we haven't planted, particularly low in the valley, actually. And there is a thought, which is actually written up by one of my colleagues, Hugh Chalmers, in the new book, which is called A Journey in Landscape Restoration. And he calls it Pigs on Holiday. And what we would like to do is bring in some fairly rough semi-feral pigs for a very short time. I mean, really just for a week or two, to churn things up in a small area probably, and let that happen. And that it gives an opportunity for germination. But I think that the vegetation may change underneath some of our canopy. That's true, but there's enough variety. It's a mosaic. So I don't think we're going to lose species overall. I think that they'll move around.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the answer at the moment. And yes, we'd like to see some bigger herbivores there in small numbers in the long term. We'd like to see some bigger predators there in the long run. But you know, those are difficult to orchestrate at the moment.
Thank you very much. So that's it. That's really interesting. I've got another question now from Thelma and Neil is, do you plant juniper, and what about rabbits or hares and small mammals? And then they've just added on when you were talking about predators and lynx. So juniper, yes. And then mammals.
Juniper, yes, we certainly have got some wonderful juniper established, but you may know that it's suffering from a fungal disease of Phyloptera, and we have got a little bit of it in the valley. It doesn't seem too bad at the moment, so we're just hoping that some of the plants will hang on and be a bit resistant, because it's very much part of the vegetation, particularly the higher ground, and it's growing in our montane areas, and it's growing in our car park, planted of course, but looking wonderful. Small mammals, rabbits luckily were not on site. Mountain hares caused a bit of trouble in the early years, but are not a problem now. They're around, but we can live with them. We can lose some trees now. We've got enough. We've got natural regeneration starting to happen. Voles, we were warned, would be a problem. And so, although we didn't use tree tubes, we did use short, sort of 12-inch vole guards. And they seem to have done the trick. They allowed our trees to get away, because voles have these extraordinary peaks in population where they get very, very hungry, and they can annihilate seedlings. And so the vole guards help. The only time we had big attrition from voles was in a very snowy winter, probably 10 years ago. And they went for the holly trees, particularly sort of high up where the snow had built up. You got them eating the bark of holly trees, which apparently is very palatable. But holly is an incredible survivor. So it was just like natural coppicing. They came away again from the bases, and we have nice branchy holly trees. So lynx, well, yes. Wouldn't it be wonderful? And I showed you that map with all that wild land on it. And it does seem to me, this is a personal opinion, that there is potential there. And I think that the story will gently roll out over the next few years. We'll see whether it's an acceptable thing to do. We do know about lynx that their favorite prey is roe deer, and their impact on farm animals isn't very great. They obviously do take some, but not so many that you couldn't compensate farmers for it. So I think it'll take a few years to change the minds of farmers, but there is a potential that we might ultimately. You can't do it without public support, because people will just shoot them.
And we've got another question from Kate and Andy Adamson saying, with all the wind farms in the area, do you think there are opportunities to rewild land beneath the turbines? This is they're now putting it in conifer plantations because the turbines can grow now be above the woodland. Could it work with it being above a wildwood?
I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I think there's some problems with attracting birds to an area with turbines, but yeah, I mean, it would be wonderful to have more natural vegetation under them. It would never be wild in the sense that we want our valley to be. And one of the beautiful things about the valley is that when you're within that environment, you're unaware of the rest of the world. You know, it's an immersion experience. So quite special in that respect. And if you had turbines around you, it wouldn't feel like that. But the need for stable natural vegetation that's storing carbon is huge, and it would be a wonderful land use. I agree. What a good idea.
I've got actually a question from Peter Dreghorn, which is more a technical question about the meeting, asking whether this is being recorded. And yes, it has been being recorded because we have some members who I know couldn't make it this evening and who are interested in attending. And I was also wondering whether we might be able to put it on the talk on the Bigham District Civic Society website. So if anyone has any objections to it being recorded, you won't see your faces apart, well, really at all, I think, because it's been Fiona talking and her presentation. But if anyone has any concerns about recording being published, could you let me know, and we'll take that on board. Question from Meg MacDonald: has planting finished, or is the regeneration going to allow for enough trees going forward?
Well, no, we are still doing what we're calling enrichment planting, because originally we never had enough oak, because you only get oak when you've got an acorn year, a mast year, and so that only happened about 2 or 3 times in the last 20 years, and we're still trying to build up our oak numbers. Ditto our elm numbers, they're quite low. And the other frustrating thing was hazel, because we know that hazel's a prime candidate for that terrain. You only have to go along the road to towards St Mary's Loch, and there's a whole hazelwood on a very scree-ridden hillside, like many that we have in the valley. But hazel was classed as a shrub by Forestry Commission Scotland, and we were receiving their planting grant, and they only allowed us initially, I think it was 10% of shrubs, which was very, very low, even though, you know, they knew that this was a project all about nature and wildlife and nothing to do with timber production. They still had a very much a timber mindset. I think that proportion's gone up to 20%, but we are now free of that because we have stopped receiving money in the term from Scottish Forestry, as they're now called. And so any planting that we do has to be funded from other means, but we can do what we like. And hazelnuts are easy enough to collect when there's a good hazel year, and we're building up those numbers and adding more exotic things. Most of our tree seeds, which are collected by the seed growing group, have been sent off to a commercial nursery for propagation, and we get them back as saplings in cells. We had to use a nursery that was big enough to have a really good auditing system, so that we knew we were getting back our own stock, and that we had in Alba trees, but they have now ceased to do this. So we're still looking for the best nursery possible. But in the meantime, more unusual and species for which we need smaller numbers, people are doing in their own back gardens. So I'm part of the seed collecting group, and this winter I've been wanting to collect holly, and again, very difficult to find holly, wild holly, in the borders. We know of just really one site, whereas if I go down to see my son in the Lake District, masses of wild holly. It's still the understory shrub in a lot of their oak woodlands. So the year before this one, I managed to get quite a lot of holly berries, but virtually none this year because I couldn't go. Let's hope in years to come we'll manage that better. And as for regen, it's happening. Hazel's coming up, rowan's coming up. I don't think we've seen one of our own oaks coming up, so we are getting acorns, but it's going to be, and if we can get those pigs in sometimes, I think we'll see more of it. If the pigs would help things like birch, which it needs a more open ground. It won't seed through grass really.
Emma's asking, what do you make of the fact that your survivor tree is going forward as the UK's candidate Tree of the Year competition? Are you thinking that there'll be more demand for you to open the car park and people coming to see the survivor tree?
Well, they're welcome to, but we won't change our policy on the car park. It's worked very well for us, and people don't come in droves, luckily. We'd hoped to have on New Year's Day a visit to it, you know, to allow people to just go up in their own time. But of course, we couldn't even move that far. It was out with most people's area, so we couldn't do that. But we were very thrilled to win the Scottish round and absolutely amazed to be put into the European one. It's good. And what is great about it is it's raised the profile of Borders Forest Trust and the amazing work that they have done over 25 years. If you look around the Borders landscape now, there's so many more trees than there were 30 years ago. It's quite phenomenal, from the sort of parkland trees in boxes in St Mary's Loch area and elsewhere, through to all sorts of community woodlands and bits of woodland on the sides of farmland, things that just weren't there, which have been facilitated by the Trust. So I think we're in a much, much better place than we were 25 years ago.
Can I just come back with another question? Because I was wondering, how many volunteers do you have involved with the project, and how do you go about recruiting volunteers? Do you have a problem with recruiting volunteers? Because for many community groups, keeping volunteers engaged is quite a challenge, and yet you seem to be able to have what looks like armies of people out doing things all the time.
Well, it's extraordinary. I'll start with the Wildwood group itself, which is about the actual steering group. We're a bit under 20, but that's really almost too many. And the problem is that our age is going up and up and up and up, and there are too few younger people. But nobody wants to stop being on the group because it's so interesting. There's so much to learn at every meeting. They've always been long meetings, but fascinating because there's always changes to report and issues to discuss and new policies to be worked out, and we're very assiduous about doing that and recording what we've decided on things. So that's one group of volunteers. Another is that group I told you a picture of, the Tuesday volunteers, who were mostly retired professionals with one or two younger people who hadn't yet found themselves a job, I think. And they have been amazingly assiduous in coming out on Tuesday mornings and doing lots and lots of planting, boring jobs like removing tree tubes, because although I said we didn't basically use them, there was a stage at which we're obliged to put some in a certain area to get the number of trees per hectare up to the level that was right for the Forestry Commission grant. And oh boy, we hate those tubes. You know, they do their bit, but then you have to remove them. And just think about all those planting projects all over the country where people have not removed tree tubes, and they're so ugly and they can kill the trees as well. But we're absolutely determined that we won't have any of these nasty things around. We're getting rid of them. So I tend to organise an annual trip to the valley, and Peter will know very well that we do this on New Year's Day with the express idea of removing tree guards. But the Tuesday volunteers have done a lot of that. That group is waning slightly, but I think new people will probably come into it, and their remit will probably be for all 3 sites who are moved around from one to another, because the number of jobs to be done in our valley is probably going down a bit now. And then there was the Boundary Wardens. That's another whole group. So you see all these people who can fit in, even if their interests are slightly outside the actual environmental restoration, because the Boundary Wardens attracts lots of hill walkers who want a challenging walk, but doing something useful. So there's great scope. And then in the winter just before lockdown, I think, 2019, we had, I think, about 50 Extinction Rebellion young volunteers, very young volunteers, out planting trees in a very high, challenging situation, and with boundless enthusiasm. And of course, the frustration is that we've not been able to utilize those people again, because it just hasn't been possible to assemble people in those numbers. But let's hope we can get back to that. I think there's a tremendous interest in tree planting still. And if our valley doesn't need much more of it, then tallow and game soap certainly does.
Well, it sounds like you've got armies of people, and Peter Drake would also mention in the chat the Edinburgh University Dirty Weekend volunteers as well. So
yeah, they've been great too. They've been out a lot at weekends. Yeah.
I think we've got another quite a long question from Hannah Carr. You mentioned possible transportation of seed by the waterway, which is fascinating to think about. Which part of the restoration process surprised you most? Also, she says she may have missed it during the presentation, but what's the main barrier to connecting to the other areas? And finally, do you have a red squirrel population, or is the woodland still too young to support them?
I think red squirrels are just coming in now, and possibly pine marten as well, but we're only just getting there. Yeah, I think we're beginning to provide a food supply for them. Sorry, remind me what the other bits were.
What surprised you most?
What surprised us most?
And do that one, and I'll come back with the next one.
Yes, I think how rapidly we got to a sense of it being like woodland in the lower section of the valley, because it seemed to be only about 10 years before you could wander in and there was some sort of a canopy. And of course, that's now quite well developed. And there's an actual sense of being in the woods. And it's becoming very difficult to remember what a barren place it was. You have to get up. You know that we've got our interpretation boards in an old sheep stell at the beginning of the valley, at the top of the terminal moraine. And if through that walled enclosure, you can look right down through the length of the valley and you see all this sprouting vegetation. And then if you turn through 180 degrees, you look back across to the other side of the Moffat Water Valley, and you see a plantation with a dead vertical side, and to the side of that, again, bitten to the quick grassland. And then you remember, yes, it was like that. But it is just amazing. And now, just to go on with this, what we're seeing is natural processes getting going. We're seeing that succession of plants in the upper grassland where we worried it would be just grass. And we're seeing tree regeneration. We're seeing the insects coming in and the birds coming and changing, and the mammals. And yes, we're getting to the stage where we probably do need some top predators. If we got lynx, it would be amazing, because it would move roe deer on all the time and stop them assaulting our trees. Many of you will know about the Yellowstone experience of bringing back wolves and how that changed the vegetation. Very fascinating. And we've no reason to believe it would be very different here. I think that lynx could do something wonderful for us. Was there another bit? Oh, Janet.
I'm muted, right, sorry.
Yes.
What was the main barrier to extending the woodland into other areas?
It's just we are connected to Taller and Gamesoap already, and as soon as the fencing of the latter is intact, we can open up the boundary fence between Carrifran and that area on top of the hill. So that will be good. It's an old fence anyway, on its way out. There is just a strip of land that we don't own between Corehead and Carrifran, and I think ultimately we probably will be able to buy that, but we're not there yet. So that's a physical barrier at the moment. But it has been quite useful that the parallel and adjacent valley, which is called Blackhope, is still farmed. And so it's been our control valley, both for looking at vegetation and looking at birds, and the bird survey people that I've talked about before. That's another set of volunteers now being done by Edinburgh University, staff from Edinburgh University as volunteers. But they've always done about every second or third year a walk through Blackhope and recorded the species there as a control for Carrifran. So we've got that very unusual situation with the good control, and it's suggested that the bird record that we've been developing is probably a first for Britain, in that we've recorded very accurately the colonization by different species of this entirely new woodland as it develops.
And we've got one more question from Mike Chad about squirrels again. Are you protecting red squirrels from the grey ones, or have you got grey ones there? Or?
We haven't got greys. No, we haven't got greys. I don't think there are any greys in the area. But I have to say that pine martins are around, and I don't know about other people's experience, but I live at Traquair, and we used to have a lot of grey squirrels here in Traquair house grounds around my own house, which is a mile away, and at Glen, which is the other big estate. And in the last 8 or 9 years, pine marten have cropped up all over the place. I'm not seeing them, but I'm seeing the evidence of them. And suddenly we have no greys and lots of reds. The reds are just, we're all seeing them. Everybody keeps exclaiming over the red squirrels. A lot of them very dark ones with black tails and black backs. Not all of them, but they're definitely on the up.
Yeah, I mean, I think people have been starting to see reds around the outskirts of Biggar, and I've even heard some reports of possibly pine martens not that far away as well. Which is what you're saying, the two go together in a way.
They do. There was a study done in Ireland that showed the quite rapid demise of greys and the resurgence of reds when you brought pine marten in. And the reason is that the reds co-evolved with the pine marten and know how to get away from them. And they're relatively light. They can get out on small twigs, whereas the greys don't know what's going to hit them, and they can't escape as readily from the pine marten. So they tend to be easier prey.
We've got another, if you're okay with a few more questions.
Yeah, certainly.
From Thelma and Neil, have you looked at soil microorganisms at all, as how that might have, the soil population might have changed as the habitats changed?
Wouldn't it be wonderful to do that? I'm sure it is changing. I think that so much has been learned in the last 20 years about the life of the soil, what's going on underneath it. I'm sure we've all read some of the books, you know, the hidden life of trees and so on. And I don't know whether people have read the Merlin Sheldrake book called Entangled Life, which is just a magnificent book. Yes. I think that's a little project, well, a big project waiting to happen. We like people to do research projects with us, providing what they're finding out is going to be of help to our valley, because we have to make that proviso, because we could become just a sort of science research park, because everybody wants to come and do stuff with us. So we've got a very strict protocol, and there is that proviso that if you have a project, you will share your results with us, and they need to help us in some way, whether it's just by increasing our understanding of our insight or something a bit more specific. But yeah, soil organisms would be great.
Thanks. I think that's got to the end. Any last minute questions or anyone that has got their hand stuck up? I think no. I think that was a really amazing talk, and it's a really amazing bit of woodland to see how it's evolved. And I'd really like to thank Fiona for coming along and sharing her huge amount of knowledge on this and enthusiasm, and taking the time to come and talk to us all. And thank you all for coming along in the event, such as I say, we're finding our way around this. We've got another talk in exactly a month's time, 4 weeks' time, where we've got Scottish Wildlife Trust coming to talk about the Falls of Clyde Reserve. The link's on the Biggar and District Civic Society website. And then at the end of April, we've got Home Energy Scotland coming to talk about heating historic buildings. So that's more of a built environment talk, but you're all very welcome to come along to any of those. And if any of you are really enthusiastic, there's a membership form on the Civic Society website as well, because we're involved with doing these sort of talks. We organised the Doors Open Day, which was virtual this year in Biggar. Litter picks and things in Biggar, and activities and things concerning the built and natural environment around Biggar. So if anyone would like to join, we'd love to have you on board as well. So that's the plug. Thank you for coming along, everybody, and thanks very much to Fiona for coming along and talking to us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I'd love to encourage you all to visit. You're really welcome. Easy to find the valley, and just take a walk. You can do the short walk at the bottom, which only takes half an hour or 40 minutes, or you can go further up the valley. And do have a look at the new book. I don't know whether the Biggar bookshop's got it. Have you still got a bookshop?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I hope they've got it.
They
If
have.
not,
Yeah.
encourage them.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good. Well, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very
Bye.
much indeed.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Night.
Right. Bye-bye, everybody.
And somebody was asking about the Merlin Sheldrake book. It's Tangled Lives.
Entangled Life.
Entangled Life, sorry. Yeah.
Entangled Life. Oh, it's underneath my litters. Is that upside down? No.
Entangled by.
Really astonishing book, I thought it was. Good. Okay, thank you. I'm off.
Thank you very
Night.
much, Fiona. Right.
Thank
You
you.
want to stay and have a word about the wind farm application? Is he still here?
Yeah. Yep. We need to unshare. Yes, we've ended up unable to see everybody, but never mind.
Take off the
Fiona, are you able to unshare your screen?